And now, the Philosophy Power Hour.
Welcome, everyone, to the 4th edition of the Philosophy Power Hour. Introducing our members. Firstly, we can't prove other minds exist, and in some cases, we don't want to. The Philosophy Undergrad, Dio-sama. Secondly, he ought to have better positions, but that's just my subjective opinion, from the YouTube channel Perspective Philosophy, Lewis. Thirdly, with his PhD in philosophy, a man whose fame and renown needs one introduction, Dave the Dastard. And finally, with a bronze swimming certificate, a security license, and superhost, your host, Shadow Starshine. How is everyone doing?
Good,
Great.
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad.
Good. Okay, so the premise is simple. Each of us have come with a prepared question to ask the group. It can be any kind of question that provokes philosophical conversation and interest, so long as it's not too complicated to ask or takes too long to explain. Then we're going to rant on the topic until we either all agree, are too angry, or too bored to continue. At that point, we will move on to the next person's question down the list. During the segment, you can ping questions at me, and whoever sticks around could try and answer them afterwards. All right, so last time we ended with Lewis asking us, what is the self? That was a very easy question for us to answer. And that means it's going to move on to my question. I was pretty torn between two different questions, but the one I'm going to go with today, I brought up before with you guys, but do words carry value independent of their definitions? If so, do we lose sight of understanding our experiences or misattribute value to definitions because of this? So maybe like a little preface is that in the pro-life discussion, life is a word that's fought for because life itself as a word has value outside of whatever the definition is of it. So someone might think that, you know, conception is what life is, and somebody else might think life is you know, the ability to think or the ability to feel. It's a certain level of development. But both participants in the conversation agree that the word life has a certain amount of value. So they need to fight for it rather than fight for which definition should be the correct one to be used. Another kind of instance of this was, Lewis, your debate with ask yourself about objective and subjective. And I think it's because words like objective have a value of being like truthful, meaningful, important, and like subjective has like a value level of just like, oh, that's just your opinion, man. It just has this lesser value, and so it's looked at within those terms rather than specifically attempting to define something.
And so it should. And now, no, but I see what you're getting at. But I think, like the first thing, like take for example your first example, like the two people discussing pro-life, or you know, whatever the other person was. Like one was pro-life and maybe the other one was you know, pro-choice. Now they're fighting over the definition of what life is. Well, I don't think so. I don't think that's not what necessarily fighting on. I don't think they're fighting on a battleground of semantics. The semantics is getting in the way, though. I think their issue is probably the fact that they're both trying to use the word life and they're talking past each other. Now, is there a value in life? I would say yes, in a way that we would define it within a community. We would say that life itself, the definition is how it's used, how it's normatively used, and then how people understand it. It's in relation to how we've conceived the world and what life is. Now, what we need to iron out in each case is, you know, are we using the same words? In which case, I would say that example in which you gave, the individuals should differentiate between life and maybe sentience or subjectivity or whatever. So that they can have a proper moral discourse on the issue and then come to conclusions which relate to the value of reality. But the words themselves, they're only representations of a possible reality. I mean, you can't say that, like, for example, when we talk about life, we don't mean the word life having moral value. We would mean the object which is alive. And it's what holds within it this characteristic in which we attribute the word life to. In which case, I would say that we need to iron out what it is and then place it against whatever objective of our experience it actually is against. So in the case of life, we might say that plants are alive, but so are animals, and so on. And we'll go through the lists of what hold these characteristics of life and would define it against other traits. And that's how we understand it. But to say that the name itself has value, I don't think we can say.
Somebody else want to jump into it?
I'm uncertain where I sit on this. I would say that a term defined is a term described. So I would say that a word cannot carry with it meaning or value, and that meaning and value to be in no way an aspect of that term defined. So perhaps we could say the word itself, for the sake of uttering the word, it brings about a value, rather than the idea which the word is trying to describe is of value. So for example, it could be the case that whenever anyone says life, the word itself, when heard, activates just a value response. We just, as soon as we hear that word, we just associate it with a value. But then we start debating over how best to understand life, and think that the correct answer to that would in turn be the correct account for why the term holds the value. I suppose what I'm saying is that I wouldn't know necessarily how we would be able to tell the difference. I would be able to tell the difference whether the word itself, when heard, brings about a value reaction, and that value reaction is to just the word and not to the content of what it's trying to describe.
Some words contain content that is explicitly valuable, that requires value. Nice, like in the sense of liking something. Lovely, beautiful. All these sorts of words are adjectives, ways to describe things that are inherently positive. They always contain a positive connotation. You can't actually find a negative connotation for something like beautiful. Now, I would say, going off of just past that, I want to confront the main topic at hand. That the example given is just an instance where the discussion isn't over life at all. It's over, I think Lewis said, moral persons. What's morally valuable? Not any sort of what when biological life begins. Now, because laymen typically don't know about this, what a moral person would be, or use that term. Instead, they use the term life, because oftentimes we falsely say that life is the same concept as something like moral person. But then when you talk to most laymen, they immediately disagree, right? That all life is morally valuable, or something like that. Most would disagree. So that's where we go at finding what's the difference is here, and what the real thing at stake is.
I think I might have thought of a good kind of example of this, is that in music, if we hear a minor key rather than a major key, we'll feel sad. So it's like a sad kind of tone, and it's just the tone. It's just the sound itself, which in our society we have just conditioned, so to speak, to associate sadness to it. But you get interesting juxtapositions where you'll have a song played in a minor key, but with very happy lyrics. And so it gets you into a very bizarre sort of sensation where the lyrics are nice and happy, and you want to be excited about them, but the music itself is slow and it drags, and it's lingering and sad. And it creates an interesting conflict within you between the value of the actual content, so to speak, of the song, and then just how the song actually hears at face value. Perhaps there's something similar that could be found in language.
Yeah, I want to go off something like that, because I feel like one of the reasons that a word would carry meaning outside of its definition is just this collective conscious we have in our society of like, when I say a word, I know how someone else feels about it. Even if I know that their definition is slightly different than mine, I sort of know the feeling that they have when they hear the word. And when I want to argue my point, if I want to get them to my side, if I want them to value the things that I value, I need to move their definition of the word, because I already know they feel the value. And I want them to feel the value about the concept that's important to me. So I feel like that value is like a collective thing that we have between each other when it comes to the words.
See, I think that what we have to admit here is that all of this is a conception, and that we have emotional reactions in regards to our conceptions, not towards existence itself. And imported within those conceptions, and like, you know, are these mental abilities in which we inherit, which are conditioned within us, which we experience through life, and you know, we gain these abilities just through experiencing. And I think that this is why I would say that there are some common you know, there's some common mental abilities amongst all humanity, and then there's some that are cultural and relative. But regardless, I would say that you cannot say that the value of any given conception exists independent of anyone to conceive it, in the sense that it's always placed against reality. These ideas, these understandings, these emotional reactions are emotional reactions to something in regards of something. Now, we could imagine, like, you know, just being stimulated to feel happiness, but we would certainly not say that was the same thing as feeling happiness in regards to music. Like, you know, like, I think you gave that expression of like, you know, like I don't know, I'll give an example of, like, you know, Annie Lennox walking on broken glass. It's very happy in the sense that the tune is very, like, it's played in a major, I imagine, and it's incredibly sad lyrics, so it gives you this melancholy feel. Now, that specific emotion set could probably be triggered by, you know, like, you know, rods into your brain, but it wouldn't be the same experience, right? And I think this is why I would always come back to, you know, Augustine, where he says, well, what is time? And he says, I know well enough what it is, provided nobody asks me, but if I am asked what it is and try to explain, I am baffled. And I would say that this is because you know, in the words of Leahy, I think, when he's a Wittgensteinian, which is, these contexts are forms of life. They are fluid, dynamic, never rigid. So the move towards your experience, and whatever experience you've been conditioned to have, for example, what you understand to be happy, what you can experience to be sad, and this might be related to your nature or your culture, or some sort of intermix between your ontology. But regardless, I cannot say that these words, these experiences, are valuable without relation to something, because their relation to something is what gives them the content of their meaning. Their context will define what they are.
Well, I think one of the relations that you're talking about, independent of the meaning, is the way that someone else's face lights up when I say the word. If I was to take this back to like the pro-life discussion, let's say that two people are on those distinctions. One is on conception, one is later on in the past, but they've decided, like, okay, I've noticed that we're both using the same word. Let's one of us use the word something like blech. You know, some like really gross expression. Neither participant would really be willing to take on the label. They would want to keep the label life, where the other person has to take the gross expression. And where it shouldn't make a difference if all you're talking about is conceptions.
Well, I think it would make a difference, because then what you're doing is you're appealing to a similar value set. So, like, what we're saying is we both dislike the word blah, right? And then we apply one to one expression and one to the other. Now, the one would maybe value it and one not, because it's appealing to a joint value set in which they both dislike something in particular, and then one wants to attribute that to a given concept and one not. So what we're saying then is that they are disagreeing on one value set but not another. And I think by, you know, appealing to, you know, a variation in that, it isn't necessarily resolving the issue, because what we're just saying is that that all we're doing is defining that conflict.
Yeah, because you could get this. So going back to the last podcast talk we did when we was talking about fallacies. We could say that at times emotive language is used in a sort of fallacious way, especially in the pro-life, pro-choice discussion, where all of a sudden abortion will become, replaced with the term murder. And we say, well, now once you give the term murder, not only does it bring about, the connotations of things which I might not necessarily agree with, the connotations themselves are of a conception of value, that it was unjustified and that murder must be bad. And then we object to that word being used because it as if already rigs the game, so to speak.
I would say when it comes to something, when you said context is the definition, I would say, when you talk about like similar experiences or something, I mean, yes, I mean context is sort of the definition words, but I think what people might mistake here is that if even when context is the definition, some contexts are so static that they don't really change for any subject. And if a context doesn't change for any subject involved in using the word, right, then it doesn't really appear to them as a context that's contingent on something being the case or not. It's just like sort of the state that they're always in. So example would be something like talking about the temporal aspect of an event is dependent on whether or not things are spatiotemporal in the first place, right? If time is a thing, if you experience time. However, such an experience is constant. So there's never really an engagement with that being dependent on the subject, even though it is. So what I think we should move forward is to talk about things in which the context generally tends to shift and where the context generally tends to remain static. In that sense, we can say that there are some relations that relate to static contexts far more than others. For example, in the word beautiful, you might say that beautiful might depend on the context. However, in most contexts, the relation is that it's positive. So that would be my sort of, again, like appeal to the idea that we're only talking about this.
Probably like if I can kind of like give you a criticism almost, like give me beautiful. Tell me what beautiful is without relating to something that is beautiful. And now differentiate that positive experience from any other positive experience you can have.
I mean, to do that, right, I'd have to like talk about beauty, like I mean, beauty is a thing that describes other things. That's what it's an adjective, right? At best, I could say that it's a positive sort of experience of some object, and that's what that's like a loose definition, because you could say something like good is such a thing, or pleasure is such a thing, but it'd be some sort of pleasurable experience of some object that usually includes aesthetic preference.
I think like what you're talking about, Dio, with words like beautiful is even illustrative of the point where I can look at something and say it's beautiful, and someone can look at it and they don't see the beauty that I see, and where I would keep saying, well, how can you not see the beauty? It's beautiful, and I keep using this word as if I'm supposed to be able to somehow transfer the value that I see in it to another person. I also wanted to like maybe relate another possible analogy of the idea of just like we're all pretty much on the atheist side of things, but if you entered a church and you think of words like God or holy or like those kind of spiritual words. You kind of feel them, even if the concepts are nothing you believe in, or have any importance to you. You can kind of feel the energy that other people get when they use such words. Like your understanding of the way that they might feel about it, in a way, invokes feeling in you, even if ultimately the concepts you think are nonsense.
But you would need to make a distinction there between cases of like empathy, where you could be witnessing the behavior some people are exhibiting towards a particular item, and then we can identify that they must think that that item is sacred to be behaving in such a way around it. But then we can get such a degree of empathy where we start to revere that item, where we start to think, oh, perhaps I shouldn't turn my back on it.
That might be the same for words.
Perhaps so. But again, it wouldn't be for the terms like forgiveness. I would say forgiveness is a placeholding term, which is given to represent what we understand to occur within a narrative. When we talk about things like forgiveness or penance or redemption and these other similar spiritual sort of terms, we always are describing an event within a narrative. Like it isn't a thing, it's a course of events. It's a certain trajectory that a life is taken, And again, if you were to witness such an action take place as being reported in the narrative and not feel anything in response to it, then for you, forgiveness is described in that way would be meaningless. I think the term would only carry as much sort of value association as the individual would have towards the narrative if they were to actually witness it occur. Otherwise, it's just a meaningless term. It's just empty, wishy-washy, mystical language rather than spiritual, emotive, moral language.
I think that there's something to be said here when we say, like, for example, forgiveness, and not just that, like any of these concepts, because it's a relation between the individual and the experience, and we say that, like, the experience of forgiveness I think it says something at least as much about the individual as it does about the object in question. Like, for example, when they say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, for example, it's saying something about you when you say that something is beautiful, just as much as it says about the object. And I think that's what we'll have to keep in mind here. When we say that something is conceived, in every single judgment, there exists the subject to judge it. And that's part of the formulation in any theory of judgment I've seen. It always contains at least a subject, in the sense that at least it's the subject who judges it and the subject who is even being judged. So you could have the judgment, the idea of someone who is judging. And I think that's an important understanding of this, because if we say that, like, things like emotional states are involved, well, clearly, if this is something that I don't experience, let's say like an experience of holiness, then it's something that exists in regards to the believer, and we mightn't be able to truly appreciate what holiness and so on is as someone who has not experienced that. And I would say that there is a difference when and I can say this as something changed in my own experience when I was a Catholic, and obviously from being an agnostic and going to church, the experience of church has changed somewhat. Just as much as the experience of meat and stuff like that as a vegan. Like, now I have a disgust response, and I never thought I would. So within every judgment, I think that we'll have to consider, like, within these, when we say these words like life and so on, these ideas, we're transmitting at least a part of ourselves to each individual.
Yeah, but I mean, again, the problem is are we discussing the values at the conceptual level of what is represented through forgiveness? Or are we actually discussing the immediate value we associate with the term? Because in religion, for example, we can find cases where we associate value with the word itself, such as with taboo language or offensive speech or blasphemy, where you've just said the word in the wrong way. And it's less about the contextual underpinning of our understanding of what the certain thing means. It's just the sheer fact that you've used the word in that sort of way at this sort of moment, which is something we don't like. And that's a lot of the time when people object to to swear words and stuff like that. It's just that word, it just triggers me, so to speak. The word itself is disgusting. I was going to say an example of this would be the word moist. A lot of people don't like the word moist. So is it because you don't like the conception which you associate with it? But then what concept are you associating with that word to then not like it? And then you would need to ask, well, why don't you like that concept? Is it that you usually would like that concept, but not in the way which is being connotated in? And at that point, we're at the conceptual level. It could just be just an immediate on-the-nose aesthetic judgment and just say, well, I just don't like how moist sounds as a word. It's just, yuck. I think it could just be like that at times.
I agree. And I think these kind of muddy discussions when people are having conversations about what is X, whatever word they're trying to use, is that I think that their aesthetic feelings towards a word muddies their ability to properly make distinctions and then discuss those distinctions as relevant to what they're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't think there's a problem there though, because like what we're saying then is there's the object and the subject still. This thing it does so like the value I'm perceiving I don't think is any different from what would say would be subjective. Like it's offensive. Why? Because I feel that it's offensive, but it's not something that exists in the object. We cannot say that if every individual could not feel offended. Like it would be like I would have to say that like if you had the same concept of religion as me and you heard someone blaspheme, well then of course you could not help but feel the offense.
Lewis, the object contains if we're going to define an object and say that it has some sort of context that has to relate to the subject, then we would expect that the object contains its own value depending on the subject that it's like the word. If you ever heard of the word "you," right? If I use the word "you," of course I'm referencing different things depending on who it is in which context, but we would still say, right, that it's an object, right? That contains a certain meaning, and so I don't really see a problem here, right? And still making a distinction between subjects and objects, because subjects would include who's using the object, right? It's important, I think, to have that distinction, because otherwise, you don't have the involvement of something with the object to make it so. I mean, that's the importance, especially if we're going to define objects as being dependent on context.
But the problem that I'm getting at is just that people's emotions aren't necessarily confined to any given experience. Like you can be offended by anything. I mean, take contemporary society. There are people who will be offended by being misgendered. Now, it is accurate. It might be accurate in some respects to define them as, a man or a woman or whatever in regards to your experience, but they might not want to be defined that way. And this is the point I'm getting at. There's this, like the authenticity, of the individual in relation to what they actually can be perceived as will cause a different response within relation to objects. So I might see something as holy or blasphemous, and you not, and I don't think that necessarily relates to the object itself. But our disagreement needs to take our battle is over either semantics, which is what is holiness, or it's over does this object contain this value that I should be realizing.
I mean, we're figuring out whether the objects are similar. I don't think that addresses what I was trying to get at here when I said that it's important to talk about objects in context. Like, if objects are the context which involve them, then it's still an important distinction and distinguishment between subjects and objects, because we're only talking about certain involvement of a subject in an object. The object is the involvement of the subject in the object. So if we're going to say something like the holiness, right, the meaning of the holiness is given in a context. And to talk about that context, we'll have to talk about the subjects and how they're involved with the object, because that's both the definition and the relation between those two things. And if we lose that, then we lose information on what we're talking about.
I think that's a good point, is that like maybe a lot of the times what we are transferring to each other with these certain keywords are really an aspect of ourselves. And we're also talking about the other person using the same word. We're having two different types of conversations. We're not only talking about the objects or such about our experiences, but we're also just talking about each other in sort of a hidden sense.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's like what I was trying to get at, in the sense that like within this, like I don't think though that when we talk about values in regards to words, these words have any values apart from either in the subjective sense, like a value within me as object A, in my experience, and a value within reality itself. So if we say that we're all objects in our reality, then I can say that, well, holiness exists in your perception of the object, and I can appreciate that in like the empathetic sense, but I might not be able to appreciate what holiness is. And I don't think there's a problem there. But I don't think the word holiness has a value that can be is in that word. It's in relation to something experiencing a given characteristic or trait and the experiencer.
I agree. I think if a word, so yes, I agree with that distinction. But it's a distinction which I tried to make earlier on, where it'd say, well, there's a difference between the value being based on our understanding of the concepts which the word represents, and then just the aesthetic appearance of the word itself. If the word itself is to carry a value independent to our understanding of what that word technically implies when we look into definitions and whatever, it can only be an aesthetic judgment of the sound it makes, or the way it feels in your mouth when you're pronouncing it, or how it looks when it's spelled and you just don't like the the number of L's in the word. It can only be aesthetic things. Otherwise, we're going to be saying oddly that. What else could we say? What else could we say? That the word contains intrinsic meaning, but then we'll need to understand words as things to be something different than just sounds or just patterns of ink. So it would have to be aesthetic. In my
do you
mind.
guys want to dip into the next question? Because I think
I want to actually respond, right?
All right,
What
go for it, Dale.
said. Yeah, and Lewis, no, I would say I wouldn't agree here. When if we're going to talk about like the perception of holiness existing in your when you look at the object, and then me saying, like, having a discussion over whether that's the case or not, I think what we're talking about is, again, like, how are you actually involved in the object? Is the claim you're making still relevant, right? Or is it true? Are you actually claiming a true relation that you have with the object that you've given, right? Because we're saying we have certain aesthetic experiences. You can claim, right, that I find this or that the case, right? But is it really true, right? And then if we're talking about a context that involves me as well, right, not just you, not just your perceptions, since we're having a discussion, that would make more sense. Then we're discussing how we're both involved with this object, and so we've got an intersubject. We've got a subject that's neither me or you, but it's sort of both of us, and we're discussing how that subject, how that context is involved with the object at hand. And if I start like making arguments as to whether this object whether it's holy or not, right, and why what you're claiming about its holiness doesn't actually meet up to the standards, right, that we've set out, then it doesn't suit holiness. It just isn't holy, right? It doesn't have that adjective. It doesn't have that description. So I would say that's how we go about discussing something like the objects entailed, the adjectives entailed in objects, like the scriptures of objects and stuff.
I feel like that's just a way that we should go about it. But what I was raising is more like, how do people go about it? Like, what are these traps that people fall into, and why is it the case?
Well, it's interesting that my question is kind of tied into this, actually.
Should we
in a way
jump to
which,
it?
Well, I was going to say, if we did it, it might be able to help us break down this initial question through this one, perhaps.
All right, Dave, go ahead and field your question.
Okay. So, can an individual, when experiencing art, be caused to experience a value which they have never before had? So it literally introduces a new value to that person's value system? Or can a person only ever have a value-themed experience of a piece of art if that piece of art reflects a value which the individual already has, but has never consciously acknowledged before? So if we was to say that beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, are we to say that there's a difference there, as if to say that the individual already has their own ideas of what constitutes as beauty and already has their own value set, and they're seeing it manifested in the world? They're seeing reflections of it. They're seeing reflections, symbols of it, in perhaps in a Jungian sense. Or conversely, is it that when you see a piece of art, it is possible that a quality of it can just introduce a brand new value to you? I think it might tie into the first question in as much as whether holiness could only be ever used as a descriptive term if a person already has that value set within them already, or whether a person could experience a holy thing and then be introduced that new value set.
I think it's certainly possible to have this lies into experiences that can change, or changing experiences, or when we talk about the values of a subject changing, I usually think that both subject and value are the same thing. If a subject is that which has certain values, values are things that a subject has. It's sort of like doubly implied. So if we're going to talk about like subjects, if you decide to change the values that a subject has, you've in a way changed the subject, because I think that's a major part of what we're talking about when we say subject. If it's a minor value, like a little bit, then you haven't changed the subject to a great degree. Now, I do think that there are some experiences that change the subject, and so so we have these sorts of all the time. One of the most obvious examples is a child, a mother giving birth. Some of the values seem to change. A lot of the times, sometimes they don't, but a lot of times they do. Or the adoption of a child. All of these things are involved there in experiences that possibly change the subject, right? So that's where I would go with this idea that, okay, we've changed the subject, and the subject will be involved in with the object that you're talking about. That's changed their experience. That gives them new values.
So I would be very tentative to use terms like new values, whereas I really do think that all values are relational to original values. So I would imagine that perhaps a baby is just born and the brain is just developed with specific, I suppose, Jungian values. Like, these are just the things that you care about. And everything else that ever becomes a value of yours becomes just a more complex concept that you attribute a relational value to a value you've already held. So perhaps you're going to automatically instinctually have a value towards whatever the scent of your mother is, but upon your experience of your mother, she has yellow hair or something, and it becomes perhaps like I start to value yellow, or I start to value these associative things, and then once you have bigger concepts, you start relating those to other concepts, and that it kind of grows like a tree. That's kind of the way I've been leaning towards it.
Why? I mean, I don't see, any. I think the evidence is at hand that there are transformative experiences. That was the word I was getting at. Transformative experiences that change the subject. I mean, one easiest ones is probably something physically happening to your brain, right? I mean, if you decide to take some different drugs, I think that you're going to have different values at the same time because you're not the same subject, so you're going to have different values. Now, if you say that the thing relating these values together is something like pleasure, right? Which might be the thing relating all these things together. All these things are pleasurable. That's sort of like a tautology, because we'd say that pleasure most likely is just something that maximizes total value. So there's not really like anything, I think, meaningful if we state something like pleasure. So I think, yes, the subject is changing. There are transformative experiences, and you can form new values.
Well, I am saying they're new in the sense that I think they're new concepts, but I also think the only reason that those concepts ever gain value is because of their association. And I think people can ditch them when different relations come over and there becomes a conflict, and the brain has to just basically choose one of these concepts to take a hierarchy, and the other one just loses value due to losing that battle.
Yeah, okay, so I would agree with that, but I think that you and Dio, in that sense, would not necessarily disagree, would you? So, for example, a concept in relation to another concept gains value in the sense that we understand it. It's intelligible to us, We're able to categorize it in regards to a positive experience. But by gaining that new concept, we can then relate other concepts to this. So, for example, when I first have tasted something sweet, salty, sour, I related, the positive tastes with what I like to taste. I'm like, oh, this tastes nice, and I relate it like to an experience of, positive like taste sensation. However, like as my concepts grow, I understand that perhaps I like certain tastes over others, and I reject other tastes in regards to these new ones. Now, I don't think that's as foreign from what Dio was suggesting in the first place, because what we're talking about is a change in, conception is actually altering who you are, and you're able to then reject a previous conception from that. All it shows is that it's in regards to the mechanism of what you are. So you're only capable of understanding positive and negative as a distinguishing experience between what you understand to be positive and what you understand to be negative. Now, everything's held in relation to each other, that's fair, but it's still a concept in its own right. So, for example, beauty is not the same thing as comedy, but they could be both seen as positive experiences. So I would say that the rejection of one experience, I mean, like, actually, no, that's not funny, that's not comedy, that's not beauty, and so on, is something that you can gain from any piece of art. So I could then look at a piece of art and I could see beauty for the first time, and I understand beauty because I've experienced the value of what beauty is. Now, why I experience that value might be in relation to the concepts I already hold, but again, it's fluid, it's dynamic, it's in relation to my experience, and I don't think it's necessarily something that has to always be tied into any given concept. So that if that explains it.
I think
I
you
think
could
it's
have.
likely it is, but I think there are new experiences that don't really fly with your old ones so much, or are just directly contradictory. Like one of those would be some depressive event, right? Like that goes counter to a lot of your values. Like you might you might in some instance lose some sort of child, and then, oh, well, that's of course great. Now you don't feel like an appetite for any of the things that I gave before. That's such a transformative experience that doesn't align with any of the past values. So,
But I would say that radical conception exists. I'm agreeing with you, but it's always held in relation to who you are and what you are. So it's part of your conceptual web, and that you tie the positive experience in with each other. That, like, for example, the sweet taste in food that I enjoy and the salty taste in food that I enjoy are tied together with a concept of good or tasty or delicious or whatever I want to use, but they're not the same. And I agree that you can have radical conceptualization, but everything's given is defined in relation to each other.
Do you think that? So I think that we can relate conceptions to one another in such a way to bring about a value, and I think that could be done through reason. So you can appeal to a person's rationality in such a way as to say, well, look, you've got this value over here, and now you're saying you want that as well, but you realize if you did actually get that, you're going to impede, what you had earlier, and that's going to be a far worse situation for you. And so through reason, we can try to cause a person to relate their value set in such a way as to draw out new conclusions. But I wonder to what degree we can use emotions themselves to do that. So instead of it feels, I don't know what it's a difficult thing to say, because I think reason is just a mode of communication to arrive at the same sort of ends as that art could do. So art tends to not be as reason or rationality focused. It usually is more emotive and in of the moment and interpretive, where the whole point is to have a sense of feeling. And I think that can establish new sets of values. But I don't know whether it can actually bring about a new one. Because if Shadow's right in the sense that we are all born with an innate set of values, then if I would want to know whether everybody has the same most fundamental values, and we only differ in as much as we've related them in completely different ways, and that's just a nurture effect of society. Or whether it's the case that some people are born with complete different fundamental values. And then that would mean that there are some values we can't actually communicate to one another about, because we've devised entirely different modes of communication to express into ourselves and others. And that would be something which, well,
they're related in the fact that they're values, right? They're related in the fact that they're values. I'm not stating whether there aren't some innate values or whether there are. That's not really a claim. That's more of an empirical claim. My thing, right, is that even given innate values, I see no reason that stops transformative experiences from being something. What you'd have to propose is that fundamental values can't conflict with experiences. That all experiences wouldn't give you wouldn't give you or change the subject to such a degree that you could then gain some new value that doesn't have to deal with some fundamental values, right? And my question, right, would be, what would be fundamental values? In my sense, you might say, the feeling of pleasure, which is quite different from the conceptualization of pleasure. It's simply just, again, maximizing values. And if we're going to use the feeling of pleasure, there's many instances in which people go beyond their immediate feeling of pleasure, or maybe even perhaps a long-term feeling of pleasure, just happiness, for some instance of a value. We see that that happen all the time. So my thing is, we got to be talking about something. We got to be talking about the conceptualization in relation.
I want to dive into that
just being values.
Because I might agree with you that even if we had fundamental values, the fact that we can create new concepts that relate to those fundamental values, we could make so many of them and then have so many associations with them that the new concepts that we made are actually end up more important than the fundamental ones we started with. it might not just be the case. Like, I do think it is the case that the fundamental ones is which everything grows from, but I don't think they're fundamental as in stronger. It could be the idea that like you can get to the sort of place where you're just like, I'm going to suicide bomb in the name of my God, right? Like this has become more fundamental than my desire to live, or a lot of other fundamental things you would think are innate, because they've just grown with so many associated things pointing at them, like their feeling of where they are in their culture or their ideas of the afterlife and all these different things that make it so important that it can just simply override the base things. But I think you needed to get there through those kind of Jungian values to begin with.
Yeah, but you see, I think the best way to conceptualize this, well, in my mind, there's two ways to conceptualize this, or a third way, which is a compromise between the two. It's either that values are themselves as if ideas, as if we're saying a noun here. We're talking about an actual thing. And I don't think that's the case. I don't think we're born with ideas which are intrinsically valuable. I don't think it's that. I think it's more of the case that we are born with natural tendencies of the mind to operate in certain ways, that we naturally look for patterns, and that we naturally look for, we naturally know what a pattern is in the sense of what would be a similarity and what would be a dissimilarity. I'd say that a value is literally a relation of ideas. It is an actual verb. It's a thing, that is a process. It isn't an idea of itself. I think there would be, though, depending on which way we're conceiving it, I think the discussion would go in two different ways. So I'd wonder, so with example with Dio, I wonder whether Dio would think that a transformative experience is transformative in the first sense, that new ideas, new fundamental value things have been introduced or replaced, or whether a person has been given a way to look for patterns or to process information in an entirely different way. And that is what's caused a transitional shift.
I don't see why those are formed in a sense of disjunction. I mean, I would say that the transferring experiences are probably both of those things that you mentioned.
Well, I was going to say, would you think, well, firstly, do you think there would be a significant difference between whether values were actual things or ideas in comparison to processes or modes of thinking?
Rather, I would say that modes of thinking and are the things that create the ideas in the first place. So rather that one leads to the other.
Well, if the modes of thinking are what leads to the ideas in the first place, and if we was to say that humans are born without ideas, then our fundamental values would be the modes of thinking.
Yeah,
because
I mean, I suppose I'm not. Yeah, you can suppose that would be fine if we're going to say that those are essentially the same thing in this sense. Then yes, that's why I was questioning whether we should form this into a disjunction where it's or.
I was saying, because I wonder whether this would be something that Lewis would get into with discussions about the goodness being as if a transcendence of the will, as if it's an actual process rather than a fundamental idea, because our ideas of the good are going to be disjointed from the actual sensation, which would be the transcending process.
I was trying to let you speak a little bit, but I was sat here getting me quotes up for Murdoch, because I think that's going to be useful here. So Murdoch would say that good is indefinable because judgments of value depend upon the will and choice of the individual. And then should also go on to say that goodness is not an object of insight or knowledge, it is a function of the will. And then she also says that the concept good is not the name of an esoteric object, it is the tool of every rational man. It is the performance in which we categorize. It is not necessarily the thing in which we experience. We have never experienced goodness itself. And I think Kant even makes an argument similar to this when he says that, he might say that the good will is good and so on, but then he says later on that the saint who, in the Bible, who says, well, do not define me as good, because I am not good. I am only a model of it. And And I think that's what we'll have to understand, that goodness, the value, whatever it is, the positive experience, it's a categorization. It's in relation to us. It's between us and reality. It tells us something about ourselves, our ontology, and what we experience to be good. It is the good experience of us, and it's also in relation to that object itself and what it can do to us, and what we can do to it. And I think that it's not a transcendent. It's not a property in which exists independent of any given experience. It's existent in the experience itself, in the categorization of it. But then we can say that it's a rational one, that there are certain things that in relation to you and in relation to the object, that is a good relation. So we could say, for example, the good knife, in the words of, like Aristotelian philosophy, the good knife is the one that cuts. And I could also say, the good human could not bring harm to themselves, because then they would be defying any conception of good, or just bring suffering. And Kant even argues that there is one rational telos for all experience, and that is happiness, because he says that this has to be the end of any being that can will.
I think that's nonsense.
I think there's a problem. Function, category, and object here. I would say that functions can be objects. Categorizing things, sets can be objects as well. So we could say that good is still an object, and it can still be a function of ideas, etc., or some sort of form. We could still phrase that as an object. Good is the set of things, that have such property, or that's like that's an easy way to talk about it. I mean, this is the way that I would form it.
I think it might be useful to make like a semantic difference then. So when we're talking about the item, or the thing which we conceptualize to be the cause of that which we desire, or the teleos, that would be a good or goods, whilst the sensation of experiencing the good would be goodness. And I would say that the closest we can have to that is in of the moment having a desire. It doesn't matter whether that which is desired is ultimately for our benefit or not. Because if it was for our benefit, or if it was not for our benefit, we would still be experiencing the desire which we're experiencing for it at that given point anyway. So desire is in of itself, without direction, that is, the best understanding we can have to the experience of goodness. But as soon as that desire has failed or been achieved, or you've gone past it, then whenever we discuss it, we're going to be discussing our memory of it. And that has now conceptualized it as an idea. And now we're no longer talking about goodness. We're talking about a good, or what we assumed to have been a good. And I think that's where the problem comes about, where goodness can be discussed with as much meaning as a process or a function as it could be as an object. But I'd be wary about saying that functions could be understood as objects, because I wouldn't know what that would necessarily entail. I wouldn't know whether I'd call... I think I could probably think of some functions which, if we was to describe as an object, we would be able to do so only through language, but it would actually hinder further understanding of that function later on down the line. So it might only be a short-term benefit to make such a...
I like the way that you're describing it as like a memory, because any sort of relational thinking that, or valuing that your brain is going to do it in relation to memories. And so that needs to be stored in a specific way, or understood by your brain as something it can access. And in that way, it is the object upon which you're valuing. The process, or the feeling of the good, it is going through that process and then attributing it to whatever the new experience is. But most of it's going to be relation to objects, which are memories.
You see, I think there needs to be a third category, and I don't think it's going to come as much of a surprise for you. So we've got goodness and we've got goods, right? Now what we need is the good. Now,
you need the good kick in the butt. That's
no, because the good would be that experience which culminates all good experience. It would be the measure in which we place each good against. So we may define them against each other and say that there is good here, and we may be able to do that with the function of the will. But the good is that moment when the will has achieved all that it possibly could. To say that, like, you've willed yourself into the absolute perfect experience. Now, I don't think that's possible without being omniscient. Now, but to say that that would be saying, like, for example, you have achieved whatever blissful state we could categorize as, you know, perfect experience. But I think to say that that experience exists and understand, to have any kind of knowledge of it, allows us, or even just a categorization of it, allows us to, you know, further categorize our experiences. Like, this is pretty great, this is not as good. And I think, like, it also lets us know that there are you know, states of being which, you know, transcend the states in which we've already been. So we might have had a shitty life, and we might go, well, actually, well, you know, there's experiences that are better than this. We may observe other people and go, you know what, there's definitely something there that I haven't experienced yet, but I think it might be real. And that's like, it's like a knowledge of something that we have yet to experience. And I think that can exist in a form of beauty as well, and other, you know, categorizations. You know, there are tastes which may be, you know, just absolutely amazing, but we just haven't experienced them yet. And I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that they could exist. And by saying that they could exist, it allows us to categorize further.
All right, since we're at the end of the show, does anybody want to get in any last words on this one?
I wanted to say something like, when we're talking about the good, the way that you talk about the good sounds a lot like some sort of equilibrium point, some relational point in a system for which all things can be related back to a sort of origin, which is not exactly arbitrary, but formed because of the relation between all the other objects of goods. And that sort of thing is what we're trying to get to when we talk about our other goods. And even though it's not a particular experience, it's sort of an averaging out of experiences. But the last thing I want to get to is, I think that there are some experiences which are, well, after we have an experience in memory, it's often that it isn't like a lot of the things about that experience are just blank. The only thing that we can remember is that it was a good experience or a bad experience or something like that. And because I think that's important, right, in discussing memories, without that, a lot of our memories would just sort of disappear. Like there isn't a lot of things that we can remember from that situation other than it was good or bad or whatever. Because that would disappear, I think that means that it is important to treat that thing as an object that has certain properties. Otherwise, we just lose that understanding. That's all I want to say. That was a long one, but 2 minutes.
Yeah. All right. So I guess we'll end the show on that one. There's not too much questions today. If anybody wants to just throw any questions at us, we have a bunch by Mr. Kachow. He's got a whole list of questions for us, but I don't think we have anything else other than that. So I'm gonna.
Kachow's Pancom.
Yeah, Pancom. All right, Pancom. What is your thoughts on the Neoplatonic monad and its possible relationship to anarchism? I don't even understand the question.
I think is that Leibniz? Like Leibniz? I think like monads are complete concepts. I don't know it very well. So I don't want to really give like a definite answer to that, because it's not something that I would say that I've really like in depth studied. So I wouldn't want to just talk out my ass.
in this case, it wouldn't be. I don't think it would be Leibniz. I think it would be. Plotinus is one of the people that talked about. Now he's a Neoplatonist, right? So I think that's what it would be discussing. So, yeah, I wouldn't really. I don't think I could give too many thoughts on that either.
All right. Well, if
Yeah,
nobody's gonna
and
answer,
I'm the same here. I'm a Greek philosophers other than the Socrates, Plato, Neoplatonism, monads, all of that metaphysics sort of thing isn't something that I'm too familiar with, which is frustrating because I noticed you've asked a question similar, but in relation to Brahman, which I would want to go into. But I think from what I know about the idea of the one and that sort of thing, is that I think there would be the first activity of it would be consciousness, and that would be very similar to a lot of understandings of Brahman in Hinduism, where you would say Brahman is ultimate reality, but ultimate reality can only ever be observed through experience in and of itself, and that would be the Atman. And then that which is experienced is illusion. That's all tertiary. It's irrelevant. But other than that, I wouldn't want to comment on it because, again, I don't know too much about it either.
all right. Well, we'll move on to the next question. What is the group's opinions on virtue ethics?
I love virtue ethics.
Personally, I've warmed up to them more recently, but I've also been having a shift towards my thoughts on normative ethics, where I don't think they're so indistinguishable from that of which you value anyways. I always looked at normative ethics as a system to figure out whether something's valuable or not, but I actually think it might just be one of the things you value. And
Virtue ethics vacuous. That's my opinion.
Oh,
what are you saying? What are you saying?
it's got more content than Kant.
I just think, when I think about the character of someone, it's just a thing I value.
I think one of the useful things about, well, I was going to say one of the useful things about virtue ethics. I think it's more useful than I think it actually is true. So it brings our attention back down to the characteristics of individuals, is what we're commenting on. It also brings along a sense of a description of a direction that a life might take. So rather than an actual thing that's been done, like a lie or harm, it's a description of what might be likely to come about from that sort of person. So it'd be things like integrity or honor, where it's more about a direction that a life is taken rather than individual actions. And I prefer that sort of conception because it fits in more with the idea of values being relations, being a process. And so perhaps the closest we can ever get is to describe the tendency of an individual to perform certain types of processes at that point in their life. So usually they formulate values and experience values in the way which we describe to be noble or insightful, rather than ignorant or reckless, perhaps.
Yeah, but the whole thing with that virtue ethics, right, is that it just gives you some adjectives for like that are pretty much, I think even Aristotle recognizes, are just seen as good things, and then tells you, right, well, this is what a good person, these are the qualities that a good person would have. Well, thanks, but that doesn't really tell me anything about what I expect from that sort of person, because I mean you've already given me just straight trace. It really doesn't give me.
That might be the nonsense part of it, is where they just come out and try and tell you what the things that you should find valuable.
Yeah, but no, the things that I would find valuable, that the adjectives given, right, for descriptors of virtuous people are things like, oh, well, this person's honorable, this person and honorable, like nothing that would certainly identify an honorable person, which I would, oh, you're just supposed to know who that person is. Well, thanks. That doesn't really tell me much about I can find you a quote if you want.
You're doing
finished Nicomachean Ethics.
You're doing the same problem as the sophists do, where you think you can distinguish good. It's same with Kant. You can't distinguish good from any mode of life. It's tied into any given Greek state, for example. When the sophists go around and say they can teach excellence, even though excellence is embedded within what you can excel in, within every state, then excellence is a empty concept once it's removed from its context. Now, the whole point of virtue ethics isn't necessarily to say which virtues are better than others, although it does tie in certain like primary virtues, and even McIntyre does that. Like, there are certain virtues that are necessary for the that are predicated in any human practice. But human practices allow us to have intrinsic values. You know, the value of truthfulness is necessary for practices because it allows for cooperation. But
how can you say that there are intrinsic values to things that he said that are related to the context in the first place?
Because there are certain no because it's like when he says that justice is necessary for any given state. This is something that if you want to have any social context in the first place, you're going to need to have certain values which allow you to develop that, like polis or whatever you want to call it.
I mean, this is where
certain
I end up
values,
disagreeing.
right?
But regardless, the point is that these exist within an understanding of what McIntyre would then say practice, institution, and tradition. The practice itself is allows us to understand, modes of living in which we relate values to. The institution is the social understanding of the practice, and then the tradition is the continuation in which we argue about whether what this practice looks like and how it occurs. In any case, it is essentially it is the value that we agree upon. It is or at least don't agree upon in some respects. It is the mode of discussion. It is the discourse upon any given issue that gives the faculty any meaning. But for that to be the case, it still has to exist within a community in which we can intelligently talk about these things. So if I say like what time is to someone that doesn't understand the word time or any concept of time in the way I use it, it's unintelligible to them. That'll be the same thing as good. Now, this is why they'd say something like the virtuous, like the only virtuous life is the life attempting to be virtuous, is because it's related to your socio-temporal position, the society in which you live. And that's what virtue ethics is getting at. It's not vacuous. It's only as vacuous as your understanding of the concepts which are related to where you are. It's in relation to what you understand to be good and where you can build upon. And this is just like a Hegelian understanding. It's the philosophy of right in many regards. So yeah, virtue ethics is fucking great.
Well, I think there's a total absence of any talk of what you would expect from somebody who's virtuous, regardless if you're saying that, oh, well, it's contained in a certain social context. Well, of course, we would say that about many different ethical views cover that like cultural relation. But I don't think that's like quite important to establishing things that we can all discuss when it comes to a virtuous person. Oh, what are like how would we go about identifying them? What would they do? All these questions remain unanswered, and instead what you continuously talk about is like empty adjectives that are already seen as positive for virtuous people. It's sort of like tautological that we'd see positive, like a positive person have positive aspects. Well, of course.
See, I think
I agree with you.
I think Aristotle is really getting at the fact that you're able to characterize. The point is that there is a faculty there which allows you to categorize what are goods and what aren't.
Yeah, but,
now the way
those are just happenstance, Luke. They're not intrinsic. They're just universals.
Well, no. Let's say there's a faculty, right? We identify a faculty. Now let's use this faculty. Right? How have you used this faculty to identify why a particular person satisfies these things? Like, this is what I would expect to follow. For you to go about, just like in aesthetics, critics go about saying why this particular piece satisfies the thing of beauty, something beautiful. They don't just go on saying, well, a beautiful piece it has good composition, and what exactly is good composition, right? And and critics will talk about what good composition is, what the properties of such things are. I'd expect the same thing from virtue ethics, but I just see a total absence of that, a vacuity to it. And that's why I don't think it's worthless.
It's requiring the understanding in which the individuals give it. Like Aristotle was trying to write an understanding of ethics that could transcend one state. He wasn't trying to write it for his state alone. And he does give a set of virtues for his state. The point is, if any set of virtues I give aren't going to be adequate to describe what is the good man in every state. And so when I start saying that the good man is this or the good man is that, what I'm doing is I'm trying to make an absolute conception of goodness. And that's just not the case. What is the case is that there is relative balancing between a balance between modes of life in which we agree that this, a good life for the soldier, for example, in ancient Greece would be to be brave, and in which case he requires more courage as a virtue in relation to his role within the state and his practice. And this is what virtue ethics is providing. It gives you an understanding of how we should relate values in regards to how we act within each and every single given state, but not as an absolute value in itself.
I would say that Aristotle does propose a perfect state in which people would have certain virtue, like a very, very succinct, like in vacuous, virtuous person that would exist regardless of what state you have. So that doesn't. I don't think that fits Aristotle's view.
I shouldn't really just tie in Aristotle, because like there are times in which, like for example, with virtue ethics, like Aristotle's good, but he's not the best. I would say that Aquinas is probably even better than Aristotle, and then I would go on and say that MacIntyre, and I would even say like Murdoch and other moral philosophers Murdoch. She loves Plato a lot, but she's very like Aristotle in some respects. So I would say that these philosophers do it better. But I think the point is that I think Aristotle does understand that, these are relative to one's socio-temporal position. And he might go on and contradict himself, but I don't think that contradicts all virtue ethics. It's like saying like Kantian philosophy is then destroyed by Kant's poor examples sometimes. Well, it's not, is it? But I don't think it necessarily holds up, but there's a lot of like neo-Kantians who may do a better job than Kant.
I think I would side. I'm on the fence between the two of you, because on one hand, I think Lewis is right in respect of saying that what makes a good scientist is completely different to what makes a good soldier. But we could still say, arguably at least, that essential to being a good scientist and essential to being a good soldier is to have the virtue of integrity. But even then, how integrity manifests in the actual actions which a soldier would do in comparison to what a scientist would do would be recognizable as acts of integrity, but would be completely different as actual behaviors. That on one hand, there is merit in the criticism of saying, well, of course, a good person is a person who does good. I want you to give me actual examples of good things, and then why I should think that virtue would always lead to those good things. But at the same time, it's like, well, it seems to be the state of the condition at play, that we can recognize acts of integrity, but we can recognize them to be completely different depending on what job sector perhaps we're looking at. We might just be asking it to do something that it can't do. And I think that might just be a problem for the majority of ethics anyway.
For my problem with that is when you're talking about the good soldier or the good dad or the whatever, it just becomes a tautological understanding of what you apply to that word. It might not be the case. Like you think a good soldier is honorable. You think a good soldier is one that obeys orders. Whereas I might have the conception that a good soldier is a questioner. I've had those kind of views where I think the soldiers that we have in the army should be questioning their orders, maybe not on the battlefield, but like prior to, so that we have more ethical wars. So we might have different virtues because we have different definitions of what makes a good soldier. And I don't think you can get to any objective definition of anything. It really just comes down to what your conception of that good would be.
See, I think that ties in.
It just appeals to your already developed sense for what that thing is.
Yeah.
No,
start
no,
talking
no,
about
no. It will always appeal to the end. That is the point. It's in relation to X. It's the order of X in that regard. It's saying that the good knife is the one that cuts. The good soldier is whatever we consider to be
But only if you want the
the
knife to
job
cut.
of what
That's
a soldier.
my point.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, but that's the reality of all things. But there is a certain end point in which we do not relate extrinsically. The telos of like these things are tools, but the telos of any given individual is not something that they give themselves. I don't think it's something that exists within them. The end of all individuals. This is the point in which he tries to say that there is a narrative in which there's the practices, then there's the narrative of the good life for me, and then there's the good life for man. And it's to understand what the good life for man is, or the good life in general. That is something in which isn't any given single understanding, yet is intelligible to us all, and that's something that we constantly debate, and that is the philosophy of right.
Yeah, but I just don't see how that's important. I don't see why
Because
that should ever be important.
It's what we judge. It's what we judge good against.
No, only if you do. That's the point. It's only if
well,
you do.
you could always be wrong.
Yan has another question. Why don't we go further?
Well, I was going to say, because I think this actually ties into what Shadow was saying in the first place, that perhaps at times when we mean a certain term, we mean to be understood by saying a value. So when we talk about a father, we mean to be understood as a good father. In fact, when we find people's fathers who haven't been doing a good job, we as if socially strip him of the title of being called dad and just call him by the loosest term parent, as if we don't want to associate that value with them anymore. And I think, well, on one hand, we can say, well, the good knife is a knife which cuts, so long as you want the knife to cut. Well, a good soldier is a soldier who soldiers, but so long as you want the soldier to soldier. But then that eliminates the whole discussion entirely. It's like, well, a good person is a person who's good, so long as you want them to be good. It's like, well, I don't.
Okay, you'd expect that. You'd expect that, right? It's fine that you want the good knife to cut, right? But when you get to more complex things, to like the good soldier, or like the good husband, or the good wife, or the good significant other, you get a whole bunch of questions there. And yes, you could say it depends on your space and your social context. However, I would just say straight up that I don't even think Aristotle would agree with that. He was trying to find a virtuous person that would exist regardless of context or place in any state or any time. So I would just straight up disagree there. But yes, of course, depending on the specific role that you have in a society, but a virtuous person would then, just a virtuous person in Aristotle's view would be one set to like who would be who ought to rule in the first place. So it's like it's so, I think, different from the virtue ethics that I've confronted in Nicomachean ethics, when we say that, oh, it depends on social context and stuff. Because what I see Aristotle trying to do is find some virtuous person who would be virtuous all the time, everywhere. So that's the kind of thing that I see Aristotle trying to find.
Is that not somewhat tied into his biology though, and like we can just outright reject that?
The masters and the slaves that he talks about in politics. Yes, he does tie in his biological views, but you can just discount those and still find that his project is to find some.
That's what I agree with you, Dio. That that is a problem with the way that virtue ethics is often framed, as if you could find such a thing. I think it's useful in the fact that we should talk about the characters of people, and we should talk about what kind of things those characteristics bring about, but only so much as it is something that you would want. Like to me, the good knife is not the knife that cuts. The good knife is the knife that does the thing that you want it to do. If I lent somebody a knife and I wanted to watch them struggle with it, then I want a dull knife. But
There you
most of
go.
the
Like,
time that I want a knife, it's to cut something, and that's why the good knife is a knife that cuts.
but the point of it is that it's about desire itself, and you're not the only being who desires, and you're not the only being who defines on what good is, and that's the whole point. The good of anything isn't an individual task.
Well, my good is my individual task, isn't it?
Yeah, but
No,
that sort of criticism can be levied against any form of moral
Yes.
theory. Because we would
Yes.
just say, well, there's no objective morality, so there's nothing that could be universally applicable to all states at all times. And it's like, well, sure. But is that
yeah,
is that
something's
really a good
contingent,
criticism against virtue ethics, or just something you could say in general?
See,
I
I
mean,
don't even think it's a criticism against an objective morality. I think it's just a criticism of an absolute morality, and that's all that you've criticized, is that this is absolute, and how relative this is dependent upon what we can do, how relative good is. And I would say that the relative understanding of good does not hit an individual level, and that this is unfortunately a problem of liberalism that has introduced this level of individuality in which people associate themselves as that different from each other, and that they're not. That conceptions of good are related to the concepts they were given in the first place, and they can only conceive so much that is good in relation to what is the good life and what we can agree the good life is. People can be mistaken at times and rationalize wrong, but to understand what is right is in relation to what we can agree is right, because that is the movement between thought and knowledge in the first place. You can't understand something as definitely being right without verification.
Drive me crazy, Lewis. No, just because that there is a community good. I agree you can make an ought for X for the community, but the thing that the rational actors are people. Community itself is not a rational actor. It's just a description of a way that something could be good, but that might have no importance to you.
Yeah, but the point is that you might not value the importance of community, but you're not the only person that is able to value. And this is the point when we say, like, for example, no, but this is like when, Sartre talks about, like, I want to be seen as this and that. You cannot be the author of all narratives. You can only be the author of you can only understand one instance of it. And the reality is that when we look towards what is good, we are all, the authors and the readers of this. We are the ones that judge. And if we wish to say that this is good and mean it intelligibly, that there is something good here, and not simply uttering an empty, vacuous word as we do with everything else, like, is this, then what we are actually doing is relating it to an experience in the first place. That there is a good experience for man, that there is a good experience of us.
Yes, but that doesn't tell us what the good experience for man is.
No,
right?
It has to be in relation to any given experience, just as the experience of time is. Like explain time without relating it to an experience.
Yeah, that's a huge topic in philosophy, right? I don't think I'm gonna tell you what time is without relating it to experience.
You have 2 minutes, Dio.
Right.
But it's empty without relation to the experience. That's the point.
Even if you tell me it's empty in relation to experience, right? I'd still like the experience. Like, I'd like you to talk about the relations between the experience, the propositions of goodness, right? And virtue ethics just seems to miss out on that completely and talk about things that we already know for the most part. That's my last jab at you.
Nah.
Let's get Dave. Dave, you haven't said anything. Dave.
Nah.
I want some final words from Dave.
All right, Dave.
Okay, so I'm really torn because earlier I was far more of a supporter of virtue ethics, but I guess I'm uncertain whether virtue ethics has to go as far as to say this thing itself, this characteristic, is in of itself a good, and that is absolutely true, or whether we can break down the question into just matters of teleos. So we could say that so a good society, what would be required for a good society to be good would be different, not just in functional sorts of behaviors, but in actual conceptual nature from what would be a good person. So perhaps all that we need for a good society is just a society that functions with efficiency. Maybe it's just a function-based description, and that's all it is. But if we were to say that all a father needs to be a good father is to just provide all the necessary functions, then we'd say, well, what are the necessary functions? Are they just mediocre? Are they just surface level to make sure there's enough food on the table and that he pays, he pays allowance to his kid or whatever? Or are we to say, well, no, to be essential to be a father, not just a parent, is to be a good moral example, to have ways of being which themselves are lessons. You see, it's in that sort of dimension of holding a discussion like this, which I think virtue ethics gives the best benefit, because it's more able to discuss, I think morality in that sort of way of through behavioral acts, lessons can be learned. And I'm just torn because I don't even know if you need to tell me what the good actually is in order to be able to tell me what a good process would be to try to discover it. So in the same sense that I'm unsure whether I'd need a mathematician right at the beginning of when mathematics is being discussed to tell me elaborate theories of mathematics in general, for him to let me know what would be good traits to have as an individual to be able to discover and unravel the mystery that's before us. And I think that might just be the case with morality. It's like, you don't need to tell me what the truths are of morality. You just need to give me good tools to try to tackle the problem. But that might just be...
I think
All
that's
right. I'm gonna wrap up the show just because we've hit the time. We can continue discussing after it because obviously we all have more to say. But for now, I'm going to thank everybody for coming on to the show. Dave, Dio, Lewis, and myself. Thank you all for coming, and for all the listeners to come and ask our questions. Sorry we didn't get to too many of them because we got wrapped up in virtue ethics. But I hope everybody enjoyed the show, and we'll be here next week. We also now have a YouTube channel. If you search Philosophy Power Hour and you want to listen to it or share it around, go ahead. And yeah, that's it. That's it for the show. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. And also, I think we might be planning on putting on a podcast eventually. We're just working out how the hell we're going to do that.